All right, so today we're going to just review a little bit about solutions, roots, zeros, and x-intercepts. So we've learned how to solve by factoring. We've learned how to solve a quadratic equation by not factoring, by using our quadratic formula. We've also learned how to graph. And then when we do graph, we typically find our x-intercepts. Not always. But remember that the word x-intercept or intercept in general means whichever one you aren't finding, the other one is zero. So when you find an x-intercept, you do need to make sure that you are writing it as an ordered pair. That's the difference between a solution, root, and a zero. Solutions, roots, and zeros are all the same, but x-intercepts do need to be written as an ordered pair. So these terms all mean the same thing. They answer to a quadratic equation. So when we are talking about solutions, to find the solution on this one, I'm just going to factor. So whenever you see this f of x, that's the same thing as saying y. So it's still saying y equals x squared plus 4x plus 3. So if we factor this, the factors of 3 that add up to 4 are x plus 1 and x plus 3. And those are all equal to 0. So we have x plus 1 equals 0. Subtract 1 on both sides. So we have x equals negative 1. And then when we have x plus 3 equals 0, we find out that x also equals negative 3. So our solutions are negative 1 and negative 3. And since we did factor to solve, those are also known as the roots. Roots and solutions are interchangeable. Then the last thing, zeros. So zeros technically mean the roots or the solutions or the x-intercepts. But the reason that they call them zeros is if you are graphing where the parabola crosses the x-axis and y is 0, that is what a 0 is. So in this case, our zeros still are negative 1 and negative 3. To graph a quadratic equation, remember, so that's in order to actually find the x-intercepts, which we already know at this point because we know what the solution is, the roots and the zeros, so it's the same thing except you write it as an ordered pair. So to show the x-intercepts, we first have to find the axis of symmetry, which is negative b over 2a. So in this case, b is already positive, so it'll be negative 4. And then a in this case is 1, the part in front of x squared. So negative 4 over 2 is the same as negative 2. So negative 2 is our starting point, our minimum or our maximum. So we're going to plug in negative 2 in order to find our vertex. So negative 2 squared is 4. 4 times negative 2 is negative 8, and then add 3. So 4 plus negative 8 is negative 4, plus 3 is negative 1. So what this means, I'm going to draw in on my graph here. And then 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so our axis of symmetry we know is at negative 2, so I'm drawing in that dashed line there. I know that my vertex is at negative 1, so that is going to be right here. Now, I know my parabola is going to open upwards, and the reason for that is because the number in front of my x squared term, or my a value, is a positive value. So now I'm going to plug in other values. Remember, 2 to the left and 2 to the right. So 2 to the left of negative 2 are negative 3 and negative 4. I'm going to write a little bit bigger so I have a little more space. And then 2 to the right are going to be negative 1 and 0. So remember that zeros do not mean that x is 0. It is where y equals 0. So I'm going to plug in negative 1 first. So negative 1 squared is 1, plus 4 times negative 1 is negative 4, and 3. So 1 plus negative 4 is negative 3, plus 3 is going to give us 0. Yay. So we found one of the zeros, negative 1, 0. That is going to be right here, so I went ahead and graphed that. When I plug in 0, I get 0 squared. Plus 4 times 0, which is 0, plus 3 gives me 3. So 0, 3. And that is our y-intercept, which is fine. Some parabolas, you won't actually end up finding the y-intercept because it's so far to the left or to the right, and so the parabola won't cross the y-intercept on your graph. There is a y-intercept, but there's always x-intercepts. So that is where your x value or your parabola actually crosses the x-intercept. There are times that if this was negative x squared plus 4x plus 3, it may end up facing down, which means that most likely you may not end up crossing the x-axis, which is also possible. And at that point, we'd say a no solution for our x-intercepts, but we also wouldn't be able to factor it and it wouldn't be solvable. All right, so when we plug in -3, that gives us 9 plus -12. So now we're at -3 plus 3 is 0. So 3, 0. So we have that. And then when we plug in -4, we get 16 plus -16, which is 0, plus 3 gives us 3. So -4, 3 is going to be right here. And then I'm going to go ahead and draw my gentle curve of my parabola. Sorry about that. That was a little bad. So there is our parabola. So we have found the solutions, the roots, and the zeros. Remember that when we find x-intercepts, though, we do need to write them as an ordered pair. So -1, 0, and then we also will have -3, 0. X-intercept has to be written as an ordered pair. Okay, so when we look at this one right here, remember that all we have to do is find the roots, the zeros, the solutions, the x-intercepts. Whichever one we find, we know the answers to all of them. Only the x-intercept is a little bit different when you write it. So if we're looking for the roots of this, we are looking for factors of 6 that add up to -5. So since it's adding up to -5, that means we're going to have to find both negatives. So -6. And then this one is going to be +1 equals 0. And the reason for that is because -6, did I write that right? Yes. So -6 plus 1 ends up giving us -5. The problem is that that would give us -6 if we multiplied. So those actually are not our factors. What our factors are, since both of them have to be negative, are -3 and -2. Sorry about that mistake. So I end up getting x minus 3 equals 0. So I add 3 to both sides. And when I do that, I get x equals 3. When I solve this, I end up adding 2 to both sides, and I get x equals 2. So my roots are 3 and 2. My zeros are 3 and 2. And remember, for my x-intercepts, I need to write it as 3, 0. And I need to write it as 2, 0. So this one was a little simpler because you could factor it. Sometimes you have to use the quadratic formula, but remember, if you do use the quadratic formula, it doesn't really matter because your roots, zeros, and x-intercepts are still the same. They are just, the only difference is your x-intercept. I just want to make sure you knew that because that's very important when you go into Algebra 2 and geometry to find your zeros very quickly when you are working with quadratic equations.